So I'm Julie. I design and build stuff at GitHub. It's kind of difficult to describe what I do to people who ask in passing, just because I'm somewhere in between a designer and a front-end engineer or developer. You can find me all over the internet. Well, that sounds really disgusting, actually. You can find me on, very appropriate social media sites at Nerdcore, and that's 3 R's. I'm sorry, what? Okay, yeah. Okay, four in total. I stand corrected. Okay, I know that the talk description itself was a little mysterious, so I kind of want to go into a little more detail about what the talk is that I will be giving today, actually while I do it. So the description I gave was we build systems. We build systems that evolve and grow with a company, its users, and both of their needs. And the way we design and build these systems should reflect the living, breathing things we want to create and leave more room for them to grow. So the question is, like, how do we accomplish this with static assets, like Photoshop comps, for example? And the answer is we don't. The answer is we set them all on fire and we start in the future. And for me, and I think for a lot of developers and designers who code, I think the future is very much the browser. Okay, so I did some very scientific research because I wanted to know what the general opinion on Photoshop was. And so obviously, credible sources, they agree. So the internet agrees because fuck Photoshop. There may be a few F-bombs dropped in this talk. If you didn't see that coming, I apologize. Thank you. Thank you for my inappropriateness. Okay, so the process. So when we use one tool like Photoshop to design and build websites, we give that tool and the company who makes it absolute power over our process. We no longer control that process, and it's very centralized, right? Whoa. Okay. So when I say that I design in browser, it doesn't mean that I write code in Web Inspector and then export it to some text editor. It means that I start in code and I almost work exclusively in code. So a website's design should start where it's going to live. And this is a quote by Megan Fisher. She's a really early proponent of doing mock-up and markup. And she's someone that I've definitely followed and looked up to in this respect. So she and I both believe that you should, whatever you're building, it should probably start where it's going to live or exist. So for me, I love building things for the browser. I love WebKit. I love styling things, designing things, and building them specifically in browser. We hear the word dev environment all the time, but we never hear design environment. Design tool is much more common. Like, you use a tool to design. You use Photoshop. You use Illustrator. You use Fireworks sometimes. Maybe Keynote. I heard that's like up and coming or something. So it turns out the browser actually provides a pretty neat little package environment for designers. And I'm going to try to elaborate on that, what that means for you guys as both developers and if you're a designer as well. So luckily, I have some help. It's not just the browser doing all the work. I work primarily from the command line is how I push and pull code to GitHub, and that's where I host my code, obviously. I think I would not be working there if I used Bitbucket or some equivalent of that. So basically, my workflow is somewhat between a text editor, obviously my terminal, and then the browser. So when I make design decisions, I'm thinking in code. So CSS3 is fucking beautiful. So it wasn't until CSS3 that we really had the option to create really the glossy sort of really beautiful aesthetic that you see in a lot of Photoshop comps with sort of like the lighting effects. Photoshop effects don't actually translate pixel for pixel, into the browser. Like, colors render differently in different browsers, and then shadows render differently according to what rendering engine a browser uses. So because CSS3 was our first shot at creating these effects in browser, we got things like multiple scalable background images. Like you can see, this is something from Dan Cederholm. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him, but he started the company Dribble and has been a really successful designer even before that. and he wrote the book apart about CSS3. So along with background images and gradients, lighting effects with box shadows, and transition with like interactive elements like I don't know, like a CSS rotate and all these different things. Now there's full animation libraries that you can use to create the same effects that we would normally use JavaScript to create. So there's always going to be this inconsistency going from comps to the browser. So the key thing with that is not to panic and to do the work now instead of later. So when you start in Photoshop and you create this beautiful comp and you think it's perfect and you ship it off to your front-end developer and you say, or maybe you're on the other side of that and you're the front-end developer who gets that Photoshop comp handed to you. So implementing that design on the front end is you're gonna find a couple things are different, right? You're gonna find that maybe your type doesn't render the same way. You're gonna find that the color palette looks slightly different in other browsers. And instead of going back to Photoshop, it's a lot easier just to start in the browser to begin with. So this is incredibly small for these screens, but you can actually see the text rendering differences. Megan Fisher, again, wrote an article about designing in browser and pointed out the font rendering effects in Photoshop don't really keep up with the browser. And I'm pretty sure with CS6, it just got a little worse. Now you have these kind of like arbitrary options of sharp, crisp, strong, and smooth, which obviously don't translate to browser at all. If you know anything about text rendering in browser, it's either anti-alias or subpixel anti-alias. So it's becoming even more complicated over not necessarily complicated. OK, so sass and SCSS are your new best friend, both as a designer and a developer. So if you're not familiar with sass, it's basically a tool that kind of hacks CSS to allow you to pass in logic that spits out a value that the browser can interpret. So it also allows you to do things like much more efficiently. So for example, this is like a really elementary example. But for instance, you can pass in a variable here for the color gray. And I can say, OK, on the top border of this button, I want to make that color 10% lighter. And it actually spits out that hex value in the browser, which then, I mean, if you decide you don't want to have all of these variables, you can actually go back and fill in the hex color that the browser sets out. But it's much better than sitting in like a GUI and hand-picking the colors from your favorite websites or whatever it is that you do to get that consistency. So the opposite would be darken. You can take that same variable and say, I want to darken this by 10% and get those effects without having to kind of repeat the process in Photoshop. Another thing I really, really love about sass and SCSS is the way that it handles errors, specifically when you're writing, like, for instance, a Rails app, like we do at GitHub. Our main github.com is a Ruby on Rails app. So what's great is it actually throws syntax errors for you and tells you what line of code is creating that error, which is really useful because if you have ever written a CSS file before, it normally doesn't, and you could have left off like an arbitrary semicolon from some element, and you will have to go through line by line to try to find where you fucked that up. And so it's a lot easier if the browser is telling you, you fucked up here, go and fix your mistake, and everything will be fine. So the great thing, another really wonderful thing about designing in browsers is that there's fewer surprises. Like I said, the translation from a Photoshop comp into a browser is never going to be exactly precise. And you don't really want to deal with those surprises because if you're working between two people, it means that you can't do the job that you want to do until they correct that mistake or make it more consistent in their comps. So you can create sort of this test suite for yourself and have cross browsers in, as I like to call it, and do it all at the same time. And this is sort of the way that my design environment or my dev environment is set up. Is I'll have Firefox, I'll have Safari, I'll have Chrome, obviously, all running at the same time. And now with some amazing developer tools, you can actually change you can change the browser agent to anything mobile. You can do it for like an older version of even IE now on both browsers. So it's really, really excellent to be able to kind of you can see into the future a little bit instead of fucking yourself in the beginning. Okay, so you can obviously, with developer tools, another really great thing that's in the browser is you can debug CSS, which, like I said, it could be a little difficult when you don't have something that's throwing you errors. If you've ever searched through Web Inspector for something that's overriding a style before, you can kind of understand that frustration. And then you can obviously debug JavaScript. So I am not a JavaScript developer. I write JavaScript, but it's not necessarily my role at GitHub. And I know a lot of people are going to cringe when I say this, but we actually now, with anything new that's written, we write purely CoffeeScript. And if you guys want to see that, you guys can go check out github.com/style guide. Our style guide is actually public, and you can look at it. We use KSS, which is a CSS documentation that automatically generates our style guide for us. So it's pretty up to date with the site. So why does a designer need to know JavaScript, or at least understand it to understand the main concepts of JavaScript? Is the interaction layer, right? A designer, you can see this at places, the big organizations where it's just very granular. Like you have a UX designer, and then you have a visual designer, and then you have a front-end coder, and it's even more granular than that at some places. But in order to totally understand the experience you're creating as a designer, you need to be able to understand all of the interactions that a user is experiencing when they go to your site or your app, whatever product you're building. So this is a little hostile. I realized that after writing it. But software crashes suck. They're kind of the worst. And a great thing is, when you're constantly refreshing your browser, you're hitting the save button literally every time you make a CSS change to view that change. And so you're kind of safeguarding yourself from those Photoshop crashes that literally screw your day. Like I don't know anyone who's had that happen to them who hasn't almost had an emotional breakdown. So we have a problem with software crashing. So obviously, when you save a file and then you refresh it in browser, it's not going to affect your code at all. Okay, so version control. Version control is an awesome design tool, and I don't think enough designers actually use it the way that it's kind of naturally evolved to be used by designers. So I'm going to give you guys a few tips, and maybe if you're not necessarily a designer, you guys can start helping the designers you work with understand why version control is important to your process, and getting the kind of development process closer to the design process is kind of, I don't know, I think it'll be a lot more beneficial for kind of everyone working together. I don't know, that sounds kind of lame, but okay. So there's a couple companies now doing this where they use version control to manage their design assets. Square does it, GitHub, we definitely do it. And there's a couple GitHub tools that can actually help you do this a lot better. So along with tracking changes, what we have is image diffing. Do any of you guys use image diffing on GitHub? Yeah, one person, 2 people. Oh, I see random hands going up. Awesome. I know you guys are tired. This is the last talk, I promise. So image diffing is fucking awesome. So I'm going to take Facebook's logo, and I'm going to show you what you can do with image diffing in a commit message, basically. So you look at the commit, and you see that you've changed this. You want to see the exact difference between the images that you swapped in and out of that last commit. So there's actually 4 different modes of image diffing in GitHub, and the first one's 2 up, and you can see them side by side. The second one is swipe, and you can actually you can drag the GUI, you can drag the anchors to the side, and it actually reveals the image beneath it. The other one is onion skin, which is basically it's an opacity over the other image to see maybe more not so much in logos, I think, but in bigger kind of photos to see maybe you change the rounded corners on something, for instance. That's a good example. Okay, the oh my god, I really fucked up part is when you accidentally delete an image and you realize that the one you just uploaded is worse, or you made a mistake. So one amazing thing that you can do with GitHub is you can actually go back and to that commit, and you can actually right-click and save your older image and replace it in your next commit, which is amazing, because if you've ever lost something, after, and realized that it was actually the thing you needed, usually there's not an out for that. Definitely not in Photoshop. So designers, ask your devs for commit access. ask them, because it's the only way you're going to have more control over the design process, and you're going to be, I don't want to say like more respected, but you're definitely going to have a bigger opportunity to contribute to your team and the product you're designing. And developers, give your designers commit access. Build more trust. Like they're going to break some things. Like, your designers are going to break some things, but they might not. And I think once they do break some things, they're going to realize how to get themselves out of that jam, or realize who they need to go to get themselves out of that jam. And it's kind of invaluable when you're working on a team and you're working, asynchronously. So yeah, command line tools are hard. We get that. I work from the command line, but most of our designers actually use one of our products to do that, are like a GUI for GitHub, essentially. Yeah, we know it gets confusing, but I think we have this down. So we have a product called GitHub for Mac, which is basically a GUI interface on top of Git that you can push to GitHub from. And it's actually incredibly easy to use. You literally only hit sync, and it syncs the branches for you. So there's no push and pull unless you have really bad conflict or merge conflicts, which doesn't usually happen if you're just replacing assets. So it's a pretty safe thing to give your designers access to. So prototyping is great for the soul. And it's really easy when you write code. So one thing that I do and I found is a great prototyping tool is gist. Using the hell out of gist is one of my favorite things to do. So essentially, you can start with the code on a gist, and it obviously doesn't have to be public, but there are some benefits to it being public. And one of those is adding screenshots in the comments, and maybe even linking to a demo of that. And also receiving comments. Like, people are going to want to contribute to your project, and regardless of even if it's just a CSS snippet, they may have a more effective way of doing it, and that's how you learn and they learn. So there's another tool called Ablet, and it's an open source tool made by Leah Veru. And it's also really awesome because it allows you to visualize gists, and it actually saves that gist to your GitHub when you write code in Ablet. So CSS is reusable. We try to stay away from the whole dry concept, like don't repeat yourself, but don't write the same code twice unless you can make it better, or unless you can improve it, or someone else can. So if it's not reusable, set it all on fire and start over. Just burn it to the ground. So pattern libraries are something that's becoming incredibly interesting to me, especially being a front-end coder and a designer. It's a good way to study how someone else implements something and learn from that, but it's also a good way to reuse the CSS and other parts of the UI that you normally implement. It's really great to kind of create those patterns or the pattern libraries for yourself, but also for other people. Okay, so I learned how to code from viewing source. I didn't go to school for computer science, and I didn't really have a mentor. I was really interested in the way that the web worked. It was the closest thing to magic for me, and so I really wanted to learn how developers created these certain effects using pure CSS. So I learned from viewing source, and I think it's a really important thing to pass that forward. Especially, I think designers tend to think of it as their secret sauce. But I mean, realistically, their front-end coder is just going to take their Photoshop comp, they're going to write CSS, and you're going to be able to view the source regardless. So it's better to make it more consumable for other people. In a pattern library, sort of like this. So pairs is something created by Dan Cederholm that he released, I think April or May of this year. And it's really interesting because it's the first thing that I've seen where it's like a kind of consolidated front-end library where you can view something visually, but also keep track of it based on kind of a module or kind of object-oriented CSS, which is really, really fucking awesome. So I use GIS and other pattern libraries to open source things all the time because I think that other people can make them better. I think one of the most common things that happens is I'll open source something in pure CSS. Someone will take it and make a compass mix-in or apply some other preprocessor to it, and I think that's kind of really, really fucking awesome. Something that's not really common when you think about designers in general. I think like the first time I saw pattern libraries was I used gerbil buckets. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but I basically used them to identify certain visual patterns, but I always wanted a way to show the code for that. Like, OK, how do you get there? And so pairs is a really great way to do that. It's actually written in PHP. It's open source, but it's on GitHub. But it's written in PHP, which you couldn't pay me to touch. So if any of you want to write that in something else, I'll probably give you all my money. So the future is what I'm hoping for is one where designers are seen, almost as equally as developers are in building products. They sit at the table, and they're people who are respected by their peers and also contribute as much as developers do to the products they're building. So as of now, I mean, I see this all the time on job sites when I look at designer roles just to see what the new qualifications are and how they're changing all of the time. And one of them is always pixel-perfect Photoshop comps. Like, that's your responsibility. And if you're told that's your responsibility, why would you learn anything else? Like, why would you step outside of your normal realm in order to challenge yourself if that's your only responsibility? So if that's your responsibility, then your end product that you're producing is a picture of a website. And we don't really build pictures of websites. We build websites. We build apps. So, I mean, I think learning these things and designing in browser is going to give you an opportunity to have more control over the process in general and contribute more as well. So you're all so fucking awesome. Thanks for listening to me. I wanted to share a couple resources with you guys. So you can check out the GitHub style guide. It's kind of interesting to see the way we write code. We have like they're more like considerations and not hard rules. So that's that. 24 Ways in Do Your Mockup and Markup is the article written by Megan Fisher, which is an amazing article about designing in browser. It's a little old, but she was definitely one of the pioneers of kind of making the shift from static assets to writing code, like starting in HTML and CSS. And then the Dan Cederholm thing was the links right here, and then Sasslang, if you haven't used Sass before, it's definitely worth checking out. And if you haven't used JIS, please use JIS. They're awesome. I put up my buckets on here because you can kind of see what I mean about like visual patterns and trying to kind of like consolidate them. Just for not necessarily for like, oh, I'm going to take this and I'm going to copy it, but it's more about understanding like how people interpret a certain like UI piece or a certain like like a drop down or something really, really simple like that. It's just exposing yourself to the different ways that people do them. And then pairs, obviously, is a really cool thing to check out if you write markup regularly. But anyways, that's it. And if you have questions, I'd be glad to chat or answer your questions now. I think I'm the last talk, so we have about 5 minutes, I think.
Woo! So
awesome.
Give a hand.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if anyone has a question, raise your hand.
Yeah.
Done.
Oh.
Do you have any advice for people with a very good Photoshop skill, how to transit to JavaScript and CSS skills?
Yeah, so I forget who said this earlier. There's a lot of people who are really interested with like the whole it started in Dreamweaver, right, where you can drop in a PSD and it'll write the CSS for you, and every developer cringes when they hear that, So I don't recommend like using one of those tools because I think someone mentioned before it was like using a GUI is not really learning to code, and you're not going to learn how to solve the problems that you're going to end up facing. You're just kind of going to overcomplicate things. So that's learn to code is my best piece of advice. I mean, I know. I don't think software development is that hard. I really don't. I think there's a high barrier to entry, but I think if you're passionate enough about what you do and you want to contribute more and you want to learn more, the thing about designing in browser is the browser is constantly changing. It's decentralized, obviously. It's not in one tool, but it's constantly changing, so it's constantly forcing you to pick new things up, right? And you want to do that because your coworkers are going to do that, and otherwise you're going to fall behind. And I don't know. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but I think that it's going to always challenge you. So I guess my best advice would be to learn how to code.
This is a question specifically about comparing images and using GitHub for Mac.
Yeah.
And the way that a lot of design works is you produce multiple versions of the same concept,
Right.
and they're not. It's not the same progression forward the way it would be with other code. You would sort of branch out literally into say 5 ideas. And
Right.
the question is it pretty simple for someone who's a bit intimidated by Git to then compare their versions against each other? And the other, I think, problem is when you want to see all of them together. Is there
Right.
any thought about show me all the versions? You know,
The way that we do it is through purely screenshots. That's kind of the way we do it. The way we discuss different versions is, yeah, you would basically break something out on a branch, you know, and I don't think that part is necessarily challenging, but the workflow, the way that we do it and we find it really efficient, I don't know that it's the easiest way, is we essentially just, after we're done mocking something up, even if you end up doing it in Photoshop and you just want to start a branch, just start a discussion, you know, and start a pull request and start talking about, you know, the different versions of the design, we literally just take screenshots and drop them in, and then we start pointing things out. I mean, it's a good visual way to discuss what's going on in the code, and if there's not code, it's a good way to discuss future steps. Yeah.
One more question? Sir.
Amazing.
So you talked about doing design, starting design entirely in code.
Right.
Do you have any steps before that, say paper or
Yeah.
anything else like that?
So I saw this really amazing tweet, actually. I think it was from Jeff Broderick, who said that designers actually spend more time thinking than they do designing, and I think that's absolutely right. I think that if you're not spending more time thinking than designing, you're just pushing pixels to push pixels, and it's not really that feeling of accomplishment that you're probably looking for. But yeah, so I start with sketching. I sketch. I don't. Like that's the way that I use wireframes basically is I sketch things out, I scribble, my sketches look like a 3rd grader did them, they're pretty awful, but it definitely gives me an idea of where to go. Like I usually don't start from nothing, right? Yeah. Cool. Thank you guys.
All right. Thank you,
Awesome.
Julie.
Thanks.